warm welcome to Josh Lerner for joining us today.
Yes, we can hear you. Special, can hear you.
Super. Yes, we can hear you as well. Great.
We will make you pick up just figuring out.
Okay, this is all good. Okay, cool. So so Josh is director of an organization called People Powered, which is an international organization that supports participatory democracy in various different projects. He has a PhD in politics from New School for Social Research and also a master's in planning from University of Toronto. And he's also the author of a book that was really inspiring for me called Making Democracy Fun: How Game Design Can Empower Citizens and Transform Politics. This is a book that really inspired me also to think about the connection between democracy and games in a kind of very broad way. And this is why I'm also super happy that Josh agreed to talk to us right at the beginning of the camp today. And welcome. And I will hand it over to you, Josh.
Great. Thanks so much, Sebastian. Can people hear me okay? Good. Excellent. Are those all questions? No. Great. So glad to talk with you today. Again, my name is Josh Lerner. I'm joining you from New York. So good afternoon, good evening to you, good morning to me. And let's see, could I get a hello for the folks in London? Do you want to wave to make sure that, okay, good to see you. And for Abuja? Great, good to see you all. I wish I could join you in person, but I love that we can gather across continents like this. So I'll be talking about democracy and how you can use it in games. But I want to start just with a couple questions to get a sense for you. So if you could raise your hand in response to the question. So do you think that you live in a democratic country? Could you raise your hand if you think that you live in a democratic country? I'm seeing most hands in London, and I'm trying to see if I see hands in Abuja. Do you live in a democratic country? Raise your hand. I see some hands. Okay, so we'll talk some more about democracy. So democracy, if you go back to the root of it, means rule by the people, right? So the people rule. So follow-up question. Raise your hand if you have ever decided whether to pass a law. If you have ever decided whether to pass a law. Some of you have decided how to pass a law. Fantastic. If you've ever decided a public policy, have you ever decided a policy of government? Okay. Have you ever decided how to spend government funds or public money? Have you ever decided how to spend public money? We're seeing some differences here across the two sites, which is really interesting. So maybe I'll think now, who makes those decisions? If it's not, so some of you in the room, which is fantastic, seem empowered to make the decisions. Most of you, I didn't see hands up. So who makes those decisions? So elected officials, right? Politicians, mayors, council members, people in parliament. So if you think about it, who is actually ruling? It is elected representatives. For the most part, people who make decisions, who actually are governing, it is elected representatives. It is not the people. So we've come to call democracy something that actually isn't really what the word means. So we've come to call elected representative government, we call that democracy. And we call government where elected representatives are the ones who rule, democracy where the people, what we mainly do is we decide who rules. That we pick our rulers. That every few years we go and we say, you will rule, you will decide for me. And this is not the original meaning of democracy. And what I'd like to talk about today is how that could be different. What democracy could really look like if the people actually decided, which may sound like a fantasy, but it is happening around the world. Some of you, it seems, have been involved, which is fantastic. And it's something that's growing. People recognize that democracy needs to be more than electing elite rich people to decide for us every few years. That's not really delivering what people need, what people want. It's not really giving people a voice. And we see around the world, people are frustrated with this. They're disillusioned with what we call democracy because they know it's a lie. They know that it's not actually giving them power. So there's a growing movement of people around the world who are trying to build a different kind of democracy. And that's what we'll be looking at today. So I'm going to share my screen now. Can you see it okay? Raise your hand if you can see the screen. Nabucha, yep, fantastic. So I'll share some examples of what this looks like in practice. And then I know at least in London, you'll get to hear and experience in more detail some of these practices around participatory budgeting and legislative theater in particular in some other sessions. So my goals for this session, I hope that you can identify and differentiate different participatory democracy practices, what this looks like in practice to actually have the people govern. Some of the lessons and best practices from how that works. And then to explore how to use games for participatory democracy, games and game design. So I'll give a quick introduction to my organization and then an overview of participatory democracy and talk about one project that we're working on to kind of gamify participation called the Participation Playbook. And then we'll have time for discussion as well. So if you have questions in the meantime, please write them down and then we'll come back midway through. So quick introduction to my organization, People Powered. We are a global hub for participatory democracy. And we try to address a key problem that people don't have the power to make government responsive to their needs. That this is a systemic problem around the world, that people lack access to real power to make government address their needs. And so in response to that, our mission is to expand people's power to make government decisions by supporting organizations and governments that are building participatory democracy around the world. So taking democracy beyond elections, beyond having people decide who decides, but actually being able to decide directly and expanding their power to make government decisions about policy, about laws, about budgets. And what we do is we work with groups around the world who are doing this in their countries and their cities. And so there's two main ways that we do this. And this also hopefully can give an indication of what this work actually looks like and what you could support and ways that you could develop games that actually connect with democratic practice rather than just being something off to the side. And so most of our work is building what we call pathways for policy change. So helping to accompany people in civil society and government to learn about participatory democracy, have the resources they need to do it, have the training, mentorship, and support, and then actually to start new programs in their cities, in their towns, in their schools, in their countries. Recognizing that this is system change. So this is hard. It's not where you just learn about it once, then you do it. That to change the way government works is a lot of work and requires support. It requires training, it requires understanding, and it takes time. So this isn't something that you can just make a game and suddenly government will change, but you can support this work. And the other part of our work is we serve as a kind of global union for participatory democracy workers around the world. So there are people, you will meet some of them in the UK at least, Jez Hall, Katie Rubin, who are doing this work, who are working with governments, and there are hundreds of organizations and individuals doing this around the world. We serve as a collective body for growing that practice, growing their impact, and supporting their work. So we're a membership-based organization. We provide funding to our members. Some of that actually could be for developing games. We also coordinate research around to make sure that researchers are doing work that supports practice, that supports people's needs on the ground. And we partner with a lot of other international organizations to help them shift what they do so that they are supporting real democracy on the ground. So we have around 70 members around the world. These are organizations that are working with governments to expand people's power and to open up government to real participation. Our work focuses on the Global South. So most of our members are from the Global South, but there also are a lot in the UK and in Western Europe. So that was a quick intro to people powered. I want to talk about participatory democracy now and what that means and what that can look like. And again, we think of democracy, we're told day in, day out that democracy means that you get to elect someone. So I'm going to challenge that. I don't think that's what democracy is. I think that is actually been proven to be a form of oligarchy, where you have rule by a small elite that hold on to their power, hold on to their wealth, and use government as a means to maintain their power and wealth. If we want to talk about actual democracy, that means that people in the community actually make the decisions that affect their lives together with government. So participatory democracy, it's not quite direct democracy where it's like everyone votes on everything, but it means that people in the community have a meaningful say in the government decisions that affect their lives. They're doing that together with government. It's not just a protest off to the side, but they're actually parts of government. They're part of decision making. And so this is a very old concept. If you go back to actually the use of democracy in Athens or in the Iroquois Confederacy in the US, this is actually more of the original spirits of people deciding what their government does. But we've lost our way a bit with that. So in practice, what does this look like? There are lots of forms of participatory democracy. These are 5 of the most common, and you'll learn more about a few of these a bit later. So participatory budgeting, participatory policymaking, participatory planning, citizen juries and assemblies, and legislative theater. So there are some very well-developed practices, and I'll go into these in a bit more detail now. So participatory budgeting, and this is something that I've worked on a lot. I previously founded and led an organization called the Participatory Budgeting Project that provided direct support for participatory budgeting. So this is when people in the community directly decide how to spend part of a public budget. So it gives people real power over real money. It's not a consultation, but actually saying this part of the budget, you will decide. You will propose the projects, you will vote on them, and you will decide how your money is spent. So what this looks like is typically the community comes together, designs a process with government, brainstorms and collects ideas. You ask people, what do you want to see in your neighborhood? What would improve your lives? And then people in the community turn those ideas into proposals, into things that are actually feasible, that can actually be done. They come back to the public for a vote. There is a public vote, and the projects that get the most support are then funded and implemented. So this can be anything from playground improvements to school equipment, to housing, to social services or classes for adults or young people. Whatever people want in their community, it's a way to direct money to that based on their needs. And this is typically an annual cycle. So this happens in all kinds of settings, everything from the individual, very local level to national level. There are actually several countries that have national participatory budgeting programs where people decide how to spend part of the national budget. The most common use is in cities. So Paris is one of the largest programs in the world, where each year 100 million euros are decided by the residents of Paris. And this has been going on for several years already. You can see projects implemented and brought to life out in the community. But it also can be at a very small level. Any of you could start this. So this is actually, I like to include a picture of my son in all of my shows. This is actually my son here on the left, proposing an idea in his school's participatory budgeting program from several years ago, where students at the elementary school, teachers, parents were able to propose ideas and then vote on them and decide how to spend funds in the school for projects at the school. His proposal was more toys for recess, which won actually. And it's a way for, at the very local level, for us to teach democracy and have people learn democracy by doing. Where at the early age, kids learn they can have a voice. After this process, one of the students in the school saw me in the hallway and came running up to me and just screamed out, "Voting, I love voting." like it built that practice for him where he saw like that was something fun that he wanted to do to have power. So any of you could start this. Citizen juries and assemblies are one of the fastest growing models of participatory democracy, or deliberative democracy, also it's sometimes called. Especially those of you in Europe may have heard of this more. And this is where the government brings together a randomly selected and representative sample of the community to learn about an issue, identify solutions, and make recommendations, which can then either go to a public vote, they can go to the legislature or executive branch for action. And so this, unlike elected representative democracy where we elect people, this is randomly selected representatives. Another way of selecting representatives that's equally valid, maybe even more valid, is randomly selected people that represent the community. People like you, like your neighbors, they learn about the issue and they have the ability to then propose solutions. Probably the most famous example of this was in Ireland, where a National Citizens Assembly was convened to consider abortion laws and resulted in a national change in the country's abortion law. Something that had not been done by politicians for decades, but when people were able to do it, they could reach a solution. A big example of this now is climate assemblies. So these are citizens assemblies that are focused on climate change. And again, recognizing that politicians have failed to address climate change. Let's see if we can do better. Let's see if ordinary citizens, if residents in the community can come together and figure out what to do about climate change. And so these are happening at the local level, at the national level, and are changing policies in governments around the world. So the way they work is that you typically have a local or national government convenes the assembly, selects residents to form what's called a mini public. So it's like a miniature version of the full public, but it represents everyone, but it's a smaller version. It could be between 20 and 100 people. Those people meet for several weeks or months. They hear from experts, from scientists, from civil society. They deliberate, they discuss, they develop a set of recommendations, and then those go back to the government and or the public. So it's a longer deliberative process. Participatory policymaking is kind of like that, but for everyone, not just for this mini public, but for a full public. And so these are processes that often use technology more, where residents can propose, debate, vote on new policies, and usually through online platforms, often using artificial intelligence to group people's ideas and to help people find commonalities with other people. It's been used to adopt new policies for things like transportation, environment, public health. One of the best known examples is in Taiwan, Taiwan, where the government's digital ministry has been using artificial intelligence to develop consensus around policy proposals and then to put them into law. Another example in Argentina, the House of Representatives has used a open law platform to engage citizens in collaboratively developing laws and regulations. People can propose things, they can debate them, they can express their support for them, and then they move forward into the lawmaking process. Legislative theater, you'll hear a bit more about later, at least in London. And this is a process, another one like participatory budgeting, it originated in Brazil. So a lot of these practices actually started in the global south and have been spreading from there. So legislative theater uses arts and culture and creativity to engage the community in theater to identify, develop, and enact new legislation or policies. So people propose or develop a play based on their real world situations of oppression or challenges they face. They perform that, and then people in the audience become spectators and intervene in that play and try to propose solutions and develop solutions to it. And then they work with policymakers to turn those solutions into laws. So this actually started out from a city councilor in Brazil who used this to pass laws in his city. And it's being used around the world to have people act out their challenges and act out solutions and turn them into laws. And so you'll hear probably more later about a program in Manchester in the UK around homelessness prevention strategy, which used legislative theater to develop new policies to prevent and address homelessness. And I think the last one I mentioned, participatory planning. I mean, this is a much broader field of practice, but which enables people to envision, design, and decide on changes to their communities, to community plans and programs like zoning, land use, urban design, social services. And so this is more place-based, where it brings out people's local expertise. People know their neighborhood. Everyone is experts in where they live. Like, you know your neighborhoods better than someone who is at City Hall. You know how the rhythms of it, you know how it works. And so this brings out that local expertise to help people plan better places and activities. And so this is an example from Indonesia, village level planning, which is happening across the country. There are participatory planning processes for the village planning system. So that was a quick overview of participatory democracy, and we can come back to it and love your questions. I want to spend a bit of time talking about how to gamify this work. And one example that we're working on at People Powered, and which maybe even some of you could contribute to if you want to, is called the Participation Playbook. And the idea for this came from our members around the world who are doing this work and these programs, but recognize that it's really hard to start these programs, that it's, again, changing democracy is hard, redesigning democracy is hard. And they wanted to map out the different models and help people to plan these programs in a way that was more accessible and that learned from what's happening around the world. And so this idea has emerged and developed into a participation playbook, which is an interactive online guide to help advocates and government reformers advocate for and implement a participatory democracy program. In other words, some of you, if you've read like choose your own adventure books, where at the end of a section you can decide, do A, go to page 45, choose B, go to page 60. It's kind of like a choose your own adventure style tool for designing and redesigning democracy, to walk people down those decision trees and to help them, hopefully in a fun and engaging way, decide what to do and how to change their government. And one reason I like to highlight this is because it's an example of kind of using game design in a political process, embedding it in that, not doing something off to the side, but actually saying, okay, people are working with government, they're changing government. How do we make this work better? How do we bring the principles of game design into this process? And so we're trying to make it easier for government officials to launch and design participatory democracy programs. We're trying to improve the quality of these programs and help them to level up. I'll go through these a bit quicker. So these are kind of the user personas or players we're focusing on: civil society advocates, people in a city that doesn't have any kind of participatory democracy or doesn't have what they want, and they're trying to win that. Policymakers, people in governments who decide whether or not to launch programs, and program managers who actually manage them. And it's important to recognize that there are these very distinct kind of user or player types in these processes and understand them. So if you're designing a game that doesn't understand these players, it's going to fail. So you need to take into account, what are the interests of advocates? What is their situation? What do policymakers need to hear? What do program managers need? And they have very different needs. And they also engage differently and play differently. So we're starting out with content for 4 of those practices that I mentioned before: participatory budgeting, participatory policymaking, citizens assemblies, and legislative theater. And to help people develop those programs, we're the focus on climate change as well. And so the architecture, we're working with a designer and a design company in Mexico on this, is there's a kind of needs assessment at the beginning So asking you about your situation, what kind of program do you need? Maybe you already know, maybe you don't. Like, what are you trying to accomplish? So that before jumping into this work, people assess like what's actually a good fit for where they are. And then there's what's called a keystone wizard, which helps you identify, if you know you're doing a certain program like participatory budgeting, what stages of planning do you need to do? Where are you in the process? What is the next square that you're moving to? And then it's built around a series of wizards or kind of interactive questionnaires. So if you think of when you're setting up a new software, the wizard that walks you through that setup, this is serving that similar role for democracy designers and activists. So it's walking them through the questions they need to answer. And then the end result is a playbook. So they're writing their own narrative, they're writing their own plan. And so we're using a series of questions. This is an older version. And so the stage we're at now is the design improvements of adding more game elements, adding more visual content. But it's a series of questions, options that change as you go through the process. So if you're planning it, what are your goals? Who are you engaging? And that's walk through stages. So trying to break down this complicated work into different levels so that people can see the progress they're making and can take bite-sized pieces of work and move down from advocating for a program, planning it, all the way through to implementing. So people answer questions, they get a plan. Oops, I guess that's the end of that part. And so a challenge for us, to be honest, is that it is hard to gamify and to make this work engaging. I think that's where designers can come in, is to help to inject fun, interactive design into this program or programs like this. And whether that's through the online spaces, whether that's how people use them offline. But I really want to encourage you to find ways to work with advocates, with civil society, with people in government. I've seen a lot of games that are great, they're fun, and then they don't have any impact on how government works. And it's easier to do that. This is hard work to work with government and work with advocates, but it's what we need to do. So I can say more later about making democracy fun, my book and some other examples of this, but I wanted to pause, I know that was a lot, and check about questions on participatory democracy, any of the practices that I mentioned, the example of the playbook. So I think we have facilitators in each of the spaces who can collect questions. And I don't know what you have been discussing before, so I'm also curious how this relates to the other sessions that you have had. And if you can think about the work that you're doing or the discussions you have been having, I'm very curious to hear, what ideas this suggests to you. So let's say we have some time for questions or thoughts now. I'm seeing some hands go up, I think. I'll let the local facilitators call on people.
Cool. Thanks so much, Josh, for this. Hi, maybe if you stop the screen share for a second, we can on our end also see Abuja again, and maybe we can go back and forth with questions for each place. I think that would probably be good. Casey, do you already have a question on your end? Do you want to start? If the sound is difficult, it's also fine to we can read it on this side, or Josh can read it. The chat and see if they want to ask a question.
And they could also do WhatsApp.
But now they can hear you.
Ah, yeah, okay, cool.
Try again.
So there's a few channels. So we can use the Zoom chat, but also feel free to post questions in the WhatsApp group. And maybe while people start collecting questions, we can do some of the questions that were raised here. So I think you were first, actually.
Oh, yes.
Do you want to? I'll give you the microphone.
Hi, Josh. I'm Nico. I'm originally from Argentina. Now I've been traveling last year, but doesn't matter. I was concerned about because you started saying we live through not a direct democracy. We choose representatives. So I'm concerned about how can this program or these techniques and tools you showed us can be applied to political parties, because that's where representatives come from. That's like the closest we're gonna get to be democratic when we have, I think, democratic parties. That's like the seed of democracy, as I understand it. I mean, I come from Argentina. My country has its own story. Some processes are alike, but that's what I've learned, that for a healthy democracy, you need democratic political parties.
Maybe we can do a couple of questions. Were there more?
Cool. Great. So I'll just turn on and we can do
Sorry.
wait.
Yeah. I think I can bring it a bit more.
Yeah, that's it.
Half
Thank
of
you.
it.
Fine.
Yeah, thanks very much. I just wonder which countries have the best record on this in general, and what influence does money have and what you're trying to achieve in terms of participation and money in elections and political systems where it's so influential. Thanks.
Cool. And maybe let's gather one more question. Thank you. Just leave it.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Really interesting, really linked to my work. But I have a more of a practical question where I'm working with playful participatory design and planning, like urban planning. And we're facing this problem at the moment where we are having a hard time kind of like merging citizens with city councils. And the problem seems to come from the system, which is even if we meet some people on the city councils that want to have workshops with citizens, the project we're proposing on one side, on the citizen side, seems to be too specific, and on the city council side it seems to be not specific enough, and so we end up not being able to bring them together as much as we want. I was wondering if you had some advice on how to bring them together.
Great questions. Is that enough as one package, Josh?
Yeah, that works. And I'll show some slides in a bit. Maybe it's so. What countries have the best experience? This has changed a lot over time, and Brazil was really at the forefront of participatory democracy practice in the late 80s, 90s, 2000s. Obviously, at this moment, Brazil is not a strong place for democracy. There's still a lot of work happening at the local level, but at the national level, that's certainly shifted. There's a lot of work happening in South Korea now. South Korea has a national both participatory budgeting and citizens assembly program. They're connected together. A lot of people don't even know about this because they haven't done much communication outside of South Korea on this. But both at the national level and at the local level, it's really fascinating what they're developing there. Scotland, close to you, has done really fantastic work, both at the local and national level. They have a national community empowerment legislation that supports participatory budgeting and planning and local community control, and has actually put funding and resources into that. There's been a lot of interesting work happening in places like Indonesia and Argentina and Colombia. And so it really, it comes and it ebbs and flows. And this is partly also our work at People Power, just to recognize that at any given moment, it may be hard in one country to do this work or easier, and we need to have more of a global solidarity and support for this. So that, as far as what's the best experiences, what impact does money have on the process? To be honest, not a lot so far. And I think that's mainly because a lot of these programs are local and are only starting to challenge big money and bigger interests. And so that's probably something that's going to be more of a factor, hopefully, if these grow and if they challenge things like corporate rights. So far, it hasn't gotten to that level, for better or worse. I mean, there are some places where if you have, say, participatory planning or participatory budgeting, where that can affect local business interests. And what we've seen, though, is that it's hard to be against the will of the people. And so it does insulate, in some ways, politicians from taking actions that may go against big money. So we've seen in some places where progressive politicians will use participatory democracy as a way to challenge moneyed interests less directly, where they're saying, we're opening this up to the people, let's see what they decide. And once they decide, it's hard to go against that. So it can be, and this goes to the question around how to work with politicians and political parties. And I'll share a couple of things. So we actually did a workshop, and you can see it right up on our website, of how to practice participatory democracy in electoral campaigns. And so for, I think, Miguel's question about how can this be applied to political parties, there are parties that are working on this and that are working to change actually what it means to be a political party and to have the practice of parties be more participatory and more democratic. The workshop we did was some groups in both the US and Colombia. There's one of our partner organizations in Colombia, Instituto de Política Abierta. They have a program called Ocupar la Política, like Occupy Politics, which is aiming to kind of occupy government and parties with participatory democracy. So training candidates to not just to win office, but to win new ways of governing. And to train so that when they go into office, their first step is not to decide, it's to engage. It's to come in with a participatory practice. So there is more work on this, which is really interesting. And then to go back to the question about how do you engage across government and community. And this is, I think, one of the biggest challenges and one of the biggest shortcomings of direct democracy, and where these participatory democracy practices can be helpful. To merge citizen and city council or government perspectives. So what a lot of direct democracy programs do is they stop at this brainstorm idea stage. They ask people what they want and they say, let's do it. And to be honest, these initial ideas are not usually ready. Like a lot of them are not feasible. A lot of them are not specific enough. They cost too much money. They're not technically feasible. We don't know how government works. Like it's really hard to know how much does it cost to build a swimming pool. I don't know if you know how much it costs to build a swimming pool. Most people don't know that. So the idea phase, treating that as the start, not as the end. And this phase of developing proposals, that is where you have that merging of citizen ideas and government constraints. And that's where you have to make the ideas workable. And so if you skip that stage, what you end up with is ideas that sound good to the community, sound bad to government, and both sides walk away frustrated. And this is really the hardest stage of saying, okay, we have 100 ideas here. Maybe 50 of them are just not technically feasible. We can't do them. Maybe 30 of them could be if we changed this, but we have to learn how this works. How does it, what are the rules for streets or for parks? Who does what? How much do things cost? How long does it take? What's already being planned? All of this information that people in the community, we don't have necessarily. And so that's a big learning process. When it works well, people in government see that they're able to make better decisions because of this. that the decisions they make will be less likely to meet protest. People won't push back against them afterwards because they thought they were stupid. And so that's, from the government perspective, that's more of the selling point, is, that you don't want to end up funding or building or doing something that people protest. It looks bad for you. So how can you build into the beginning this engagement so that you end up at a better solution?
Thanks so much. So we have 2 questions now from Abuja coming in. Josh, one you can see on the Zoom chat, but I'll read it out loud anyway. So one question from here is, how were you able to manage your democracy at the early stage? For context, Nigeria's democracy started in 1960, but a more percentage of this time has been under military rule, and democracy returned in 1999. So I guess that's about kind of participatory democracy when democracy is really unstable. And the other question is, how do we use board games to hold government accountable? So one very specific one, one very general one.
So the first question about, how do you do this work in maybe either unstable or unsupportive contexts? It's hard, but actually it's happened a lot. And frankly, even if you go back to like Brazil in the late 80s, when both participatory budgeting and legislative theater developed, it was at the end of a brutal dictatorship. And it was a very difficult time. Democracy was new. There was not a lot of infrastructure or support for this. It wasn't an established practice. And so in some ways, that's an opportunity to be bold and to try something new. And so that we've seen that in many places. There's also, you can do things at different levels of government. So you'd be surprised, but actually there's a lot of participatory democracy in China at the local level. In Russia, even, at least up to a month ago. Whether that continues now is a question. But Russia had some of the most active participatory budgeting in the world at the local level, because local governments had some space. Even when there was national anti-democratic practices, there's often space at the local level, whether that's a village, a neighborhood, a town, a school. And so that's been one of the strategies that we've seen activists use, is to start local, start where there's someone who does support this, recognize that you don't have that at other levels of government, recognize there's a lot of spaces that are closed, but say, like, where are there people who want to try something different? Where are there people who want to have real democracy, and build out from there? It's not easy. There's no easy answer to this, but that's what we've seen happen. And then the question around board games, there have been some interesting board games that have, or card games that have been used. I would say that there's, and maybe I can show some more slides on this in a bit, but games that you have to know your audience well. So if it's a game for the planners and the organizers, that's one thing. If it's a game for people who are participating in the process, that's a very different thing. And so there've been some games that are more for planning a process, or for planning a campaign, or for organizing. There's a great one that we have in our house and play often called Rise Up, which is for organizing a campaign. And it's actually fun. Like, my 10-year-old loves playing it. So that's a good example, I think, of one it's for people who are like doing the work, who are organizing this. It's called Rise Up. But also I've seen good games that are used in the process, like in the community meetings, but they need to be lighter, because you have a limited time with people and they don't have time to learn complex rules. So those have been, I've seen card games be more useful there, where something you can quickly play in like 5, 10, 15 minutes. There was a card game that we used in participatory budgeting called At Stake, which was a kind of like a role-playing game where you got a card from a different actor, and then we're asked to kind of propose projects that met your agenda, and you had like a secret agenda based on your card. And that worked pretty well. People just had one card to read, and then they could use that. When it gets more complicated than that, it can be hard. So I'd say keep it simple, but there is a space for that, for sure. And I can, maybe I can show a few more images too of some games, and this is from my book. So as Sebastian mentioned, I wrote a book called Making Democracy Fun. And it was very much based on like how do you use games and game design in democratic processes. And so just to give you a taste of what some of those games look like, this is still available if you want to get a copy. And I think that one thing I distinguish between and I encourage is thinking about when to use games and when to use game design. And game design can be as powerful as an actual game and can often be more appropriate. So for games themselves, a lot of the ones that I looked at were in-person, very light games. So this one you may actually, in London, I wouldn't be surprised if you played this later. It's a Theatre of the Oppressed game called Good Day, where you go around shaking people's hands and clinging to them. Theatre of the Oppressed has a lot of great games. Complete the Image, where you act out images with your bodies. It's kind of like a charades kind of game for team building. And games that get people to move are often very effective for team building. It generates bonds and comfort with people. Capacity building games, so they help to build people's understanding and knowledge. So we adapted Jeopardy to participatory budgeting, having people learn about the budget through a Jeopardy format rather than just giving them a presentation. Matching games are for analysis when there's like complex information and you're trying to figure out what to do. So kind of puzzles help people to figure out complex systems. And then I think the last one here, decision-making games and forum theater, which in London you'll learn about in a bit, where you're actually trying to decide by acting out decision-making processes. But the main thing I want to emphasize is like how game mechanics can be used, even if you don't have a full game. And so these are some of the main game mechanics that I saw used in some of the better and more engaging processes. Conflict structures, the rules, outcomes, and engagements. And for each of these, there's different roles they can play. So for conflict structures, to generate what I call collaborative competition, I mean, like in a game of football, where you have competition between teams, but also collaboration within teams. And this is really essential for deliberative processes. For rules, for establishing clear and legitimate rules, often that's a challenge of participation. It's not clear to people on the ground how things work. Outcomes, linking participation to measurable outcomes. People can see the results. This is something games are very good at. You win, you lose, you get a certain number of points. Lots of community meetings you go to and it's not clear what's the outcome, besides spending 2 hours of your day at some meeting. And then for engagement, for engaging the senses. So just some examples of this, and using magic circles, a core game design concept to create a space where people can feel free to play. So this is an example from participatory budgeting where they had the process actually at city council chambers. And so when people entered into that, they entered into a different space. They were on stage literally. And so that enabled them to play and to engage differently. Group versus system conflicts. This is something that participatory budgeting does well, where you have often teams of community members developing proposals for a ballot. And so in a sense, they're competing against each other for funding, but also they're working together to develop projects for a ballot. Participant generation of rules. And this is I think a good space for things like board games, where you have a steering committee, an advisory group, a planning group. They're designing a process. And this is where you actually can play a game together, and where you can learn about and develop and write the rules for a process. Multimodal presentation of rules, like presenting rules in different ways. If that's on the board, if that's orally, if that's in materials, You know, if you play a board game like Monopoly, sure, there's the instructions, but most of us learn to get $200 when you pass go because it's written on the game board. Every time you land in that square, it says get $200. So how can we bring those rules into games more visibly, into programs more visibly? And then this is one of the most important ones, is linking participation with measurable outcomes. Like, what are the results? This is from Argentina. That because of the program, there's a new plaza. And it says it's because of participatory budgeting. Because people walk there, they see, oh, this plaza exists because I participated. Points for measuring people's participation, for voting. So I know we're running out of time. Enjoyable core mechanics. So how do you have people do actions that are actually fun? Most of these processes rely on discussion, which can be fun, but can also be kind of dry. So how can you make actions? In this case, it's like literally putting stickers on a board to vote is more fun than just saying I support or I don't support. Sound effects, a program that used a gong to measure time. Yeah, that is the conclusion roughly of the book, that we can use these techniques to make democracy fun, but also to make it work.
Josh, are we able to get those slides?
Yeah, I can share all this. And again, this is all from Making Democracy Fun, the book as well. Yeah, I can share this as well.
You get the book also into the camp. Super. So there's one final question here that came in the WhatsApp, but maybe if you can, a very short answer would be good, so people have a break also for going into the workshop. And this question is from Julie Tremblay. Do people-powered work with city councils to try changing the system in order to involve citizens under legal age, for example, teenagers, in decision-making at city scale, beyond schools, where the system often overlooks them since they cannot vote, etc.?
Yes. I mean, yeah, a lot of these programs, that's one of the great things, is when you're designing new democracy spaces, you can design new rules. And so like in participatory budgeting, usually the voting age is much lower. Like in New York, it's 11 now. So 11-year-olds can vote. Other places have no minimums. So yeah, you can do that. We're starting a new project, a global project that is focused especially on youth participation. And part of that will be kind of developing some tools and resources for people doing things like youth participatory budgeting. And so there could be an opportunity for games in that, if anyone is interested in getting involved. So yeah, that's something we're actively supporting.
Super. So yeah, so let's leave it there. Big thanks, Josh, for this really great presentation.
Thank you.
Great. And yeah, let's talk further in the chat about maybe getting some resources to people here. We'll have the book, and have a great day.
Great. Yeah, feel free to reach out if you have other ideas. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks, everyone.
All right. So,
Bye.